My name is Sienna. I am 32 years old, and most people who meet me for the first time usually come to the same quiet conclusion about who I am. They think I'm observant, but passive, kind, but maybe a little naive, the kind of person who listens more than she speaks. I work as a community archivist, which is a job that sounds more impressive than it usually feels. My days are spent cataloging local records, scanning old photographs, and preserving fragments of lives that most people have already forgotten. In other words, I pay attention to small things. Maybe that's why the story I'm about to tell stayed with me for so many years. Because if you weren't paying attention, you would miss it entirely. This isn't a story about revenge. It isn't about exposing someone. And it definitely isn't about drama. It's about understanding someone you thought you knew and realizing how wrong you were. For most of my life, my father was the kind of man people barely noticed. He wasn't loud. He didn't tell long stories at dinner. He didn't give lectures about life or success. He was the type of person who fixed things quietly. The fence when it leaned, the car when it rattled, the broken kitchen drawer no one else bothered to repair. Growing up, I sometimes wondered if that silence meant distance. Not coldness exactly, just a kind of emotional quiet that made it hard to read him. And there was one habit he had that never made sense to me. For years, literally years, my father would leave the house every single night at exactly 9 o'clock. No explanation, no conversation about it. He would grab his old jacket, check the time once, and walk out the door like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. At first, I assumed it was just a routine. Maybe a walk, maybe fresh air. But routines are funny things. If you watch them long enough, you start to notice the details that don't quite fit. And one night, when I was 24, curiosity finally got the better of me, so I followed him. What I discovered that night didn't expose a secret in the dramatic way people imagine. There was no scandal, no hidden life. Instead, what I saw changed something much deeper. It made me realize that the quietest people sometimes carry the largest acts of kindness and the heaviest burdens without ever asking to be seen. And once you see something like that, you can never look at them the same way again. But before I tell you what happened that night, let me explain something first. Because the truth is, for most of my life, I misunderstood my father completely. And the strange thing is, I wasn't the only one. So before we get to the night, I followed him. There's someone you need to meet. Me. But not the version of me you're hearing right now. The version everyone thought they knew. Before I continue, let me ask you something. Have you ever discovered something about someone close to you that quietly rewrote your entire understanding of them? Before the night, I followed my father. Before any quiet revelations or shifts in how I saw him, there was a version of me that most people around me had already decided on. Not out loud, of course. People rarely say those things directly. But you can feel it in the way conversations move around you, in the roles you're given without being asked. To most people, I was the calm one, the dependable daughter, the person who didn't cause trouble, the one who listened patiently while other people filled the room with their opinions. If you had asked my coworkers at the archive, they would probably have described me as pleasant, reliable, organized, quiet, the kind of person who always remembered birthdays and labeled files correctly. It's not a bad reputation to have. But there's a difference between being respected and being overlooked. And most of the time, I lived somewhere in that space. At work, I was the one who noticed when old documents were misfiled or when someone accidentally scanned a record twice. I fixed small mistakes before they became big ones, but those corrections rarely needed an announcement. They just happened. At family gatherings, I was the daughter who helped clean the kitchen after dinner while conversations continued in the living room without me. No one told me to do it, but somehow I always ended up there. The strange thing is, I didn't resent it. Not then. Part of me even preferred it. When you're quiet, people assume you're not paying attention. And when people believe that, they reveal more of themselves than they usually would. I learned early that listening carefully is a kind of power most people underestimate. But back then, I didn't think of it that way. Back then, it simply felt like being invisible. My father and I had a similar kind of quiet presence in the house. We were different in many ways, but in one important sense, we were alike. Neither of us demanded attention. My mother was the one who filled the space with stories and plans and questions about everyone's day. My father and I often sat at the same dinner table, saying very little. But that silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It felt understood. Still, even within that quiet rhythm of our household, there was one thing about my father that remained oddly separate from the rest of his life. The 9 p.m. routine. Every night. Exactly 9. Not 9:05, not 8:58. 9. The first time I really noticed it, I was probably 17. I remember glancing at the clock above the microwave while finishing homework at the kitchen table. My father stood up from his chair, checked the same clock, and reached for his jacket hanging by the back door. It was an old brown one he'd had for years. Worn sleeves, small tear near the pocket that he never bothered fixing. He didn't say where he was going. He just said, "I'll be back later." My mother barely looked up from the television. "All right," she said, like it was the most normal thing in the world. And maybe it was. But over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Rainy nights, cold winter evenings, even holidays. At 9 o'clock, my father would leave the house. Sometimes he came back within an hour, sometimes longer. But he never talked about it. And strangely, no one ever asked. Not my mother, not my relatives, not even me. At least, not out loud. But quiet people notice quiet things. And the older I got, the more that routine began to feel less like a simple walk and more like a chapter of his life that existed somewhere just beyond the edge of our family's understanding. I didn't push for answers. That was the role people assumed I would play anyway. The daughter who didn't question things. The daughter who accepted silence. But there's something important about quiet observation. You can ignore it for years. Until one small moment makes you realize you've been watching the wrong details all along. And that moment came sooner than I expected. Because sometimes, the first crack in how people see you, or how you see them, doesn't arrive with an argument. It arrives with something much smaller. Something easy for everyone else to dismiss, but impossible for you to forget. The first moment that stayed with me wasn't dramatic. No argument, no confrontation, just a small detail that landed quietly and refused to leave. It happened on a Thursday evening in late autumn. I remember the season clearly because the air had that sharp chill that arrives just before winter settles in, the kind that makes the windows fog slightly when someone cooks. I was 21 and home from university for a few days. Dinner had been simple that night. Soup, bread, and the kind of casual conversation families have when no one has anything urgent to say. My mother talked about a neighbor who had repainted their house a strange shade of blue. My father mostly listened. I mostly listened too. That part wasn't unusual, but as the conversation drifted along, I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. My father kept glancing at the clock. Not nervously, just carefully, like someone tracking time without drawing attention to it. 8:54, 8:57, 8:59, then 9. Right on cue, he stood up. "I'll be back later," he said, reaching for the brown jacket. The same words he always used. Routine can be comforting when you grow up around it. Patterns become part of the background of life. But that night, for reasons I still can't fully explain, the routine suddenly felt deliberate. Not casual, not accidental, intentional. As he walked toward the door, my mother said something that caught my attention. Don't forget the bag this time." My father paused for half a second. Then he turned back toward the kitchen counter. And that's when I saw it. A small canvas tote bag is sitting near the sink. Plain, off-white fabric. The kind grocery stores sometimes sell for a few dollars. He picked it up without comment and slipped it over his shoulder. I remember watching him closely then. Not in a suspicious way, just curious. Because for the first time, the routine looked like it had a purpose. "Where are you going?" I asked casually. It was the first time I had ever asked the question. The room stayed quiet for a moment. Not tense, just still. My father looked at me with the same calm expression he always had. "Just out for a bit," he said. Then he opened the door and stepped outside. That was it. No explanation, no follow-up. And strangely, no one else seemed interested. My mother continued eating as if nothing unusual had happened. The television murmured in the living room. The clock ticked softly above the stove. But something about that bag stayed with me. It wasn't the bag itself. It was the way my father had almost forgotten it, and the way my mother had reminded him, as if both of them knew exactly what it was for. Except me. Later that night, when he returned, the bag wasn't empty. I noticed it because he set it gently on the kitchen counter before heading to bed. Inside were only a few things. An empty plastic container, a folded napkin, and a spoon. Nothing mysterious, nothing dramatic, but the pieces didn't quite fit the simple explanation I had always assumed, that my father just went for walks. Walks didn't usually require containers and spoons. I didn't ask him about it, not that night. Like I said earlier, I was used to being the quiet one, the daughter who didn't press too hard on unanswered questions. But once you notice something unusual inside a familiar routine, your mind starts to replay every previous moment. Every night he left, every time he returned. And suddenly, the pattern that once felt ordinary begins to look like a puzzle you somehow missed for years. Most people would have let it go. Maybe even I would have. Except for one small realization that arrived later that week. Because once I started paying attention, I realized the bag wasn't always empty when he left. Sometimes, it was already full. Once I noticed the bag, it became strangely difficult not to notice everything else. The human brain does that sometimes. One small detail shifts into focus, and suddenly, an entire pattern begins to reveal itself. Before that Thursday evening, my father's nightly routine had always existed in the background of our lives, like the hum of the refrigerator or the sound of traffic outside. You hear it, but you don't really listen. But after seeing the container and spoon inside that bag, I started paying attention in a way I hadn't before. Not obsessively, just quietly, the way someone like me naturally observes things. Over the next few days, I began noticing small moments that had always been there, unnoticed by everyone, including me. For example, the kitchen around 8:30 at night. My father would start moving around in a particular rhythm, not rushed, not secretive, just deliberate. He would open the refrigerator, take out leftovers from dinner, and place them carefully into plastic containers. Sometimes soup, sometimes rice or pasta. Occasionally, fruit is wrapped in paper towels. He never packed large amounts, just enough for one person. At first, I thought maybe he was preparing something for himself for later. But that idea didn't quite make sense. He never ate those leftovers when he returned home. Instead, the containers came back empty. And somehow, the rest of the house behaved as if this routine was completely ordinary. My mother would walk through the kitchen while he packed the food and ask casual questions about work. My father would answer calmly. Neither of them explained the food. Neither of them discussed where he was going. It was simply part of the evening. And the strange thing was, even after I noticed it, I found myself pretending not to notice. Maybe that sounds strange, But families often work that way. We adapt to the quiet rules of a household without ever officially agreeing to them. And one of the unspoken rules in ours seemed to be this: we don't ask about 9 p.m. Looking back now, I realize how easily silence becomes normal. You see something unusual once, and you assume there's a reasonable explanation. You see it again, and it becomes routine. By the third or fourth time, it simply blends into daily life. And that's exactly what happened to me. Even though I had begun to notice the containers in the bag, I didn't confront my father. I didn't press my mother for answers. Instead, I did what I had always done best. I observed. And the more I watched, the more I realized that the routine wasn't just about the food. There were other details too. My father always checked the weather before leaving. If it was raining, he packed an extra cloth napkin in the bag. If it was especially cold, he wrapped the containers in a small kitchen towel. Those weren't the habits of someone going for a casual walk. Those were the habits of someone delivering something carefully. Still, I kept my thoughts to myself. Partly because I didn't want to seem suspicious, but partly because I sensed something else beneath the routine. Something gentle, something intentional, and somehow I felt that asking too directly might disrupt it. So the days passed, then weeks, and slowly, even my curiosity began to settle into the same quiet acceptance that everyone else seemed to have. The bag, the containers, the 9 p.m. departure. They became background again. Almost. Because once you've noticed something once, your mind never fully forgets it. And every now and then, a new detail appears that makes the puzzle a little clearer. In my case, that detail arrived on a cold winter night when I happened to look out the living room window at exactly the right moment. What I saw wasn't shocking. It was simple. But it revealed something important. For the first time, I saw where my father walked after leaving the house. And it wasn't the direction I expected. That winter night, the house was unusually quiet. My mother had already gone to bed early, claiming a headache. The television in the living room was muted, casting soft flickers of light across the walls while I sat on the couch with a book I wasn't really reading. Outside, the street was damp from melting frost. I remember glancing at the clock almost without thinking. 8:58. Somehow, even though I hadn't consciously decided to pay attention anymore, my body still expected the moment. At exactly 9 o'clock, the familiar sound came, the soft creak of the back door opening. Footsteps on the porch. Then silence. For a few seconds, I stayed where I was. But something inside me nudged gently, the way curiosity sometimes does when it's been waiting patiently for a long time. So I stood up and walked to the front window. Not dramatically, not like someone spying, just looking. Our house sat on a quiet residential street where most people had already settled in for the night. Streetlights cast warm yellow circles on the pavement, and the cold air made the whole neighborhood feel still. I watched my father step onto the sidewalk. Brown jacket, canvas bag over his shoulder. He paused for a moment, the way he always did, checking the strap, adjusting the weight of the bag slightly. Then he started walking. What surprised me wasn't that he walked, it was the direction. For years, I had assumed he took the path toward the small park 2 blocks away. That would have made sense. Many people in the neighborhood walked there in the evenings. But my father didn't turn toward the park. He walked the opposite way. Down the narrower side of the street, toward the older houses, toward the part of the neighborhood that most people rarely pass through unless they lived there. I remember watching until he disappeared behind the line of trees near the corner, and standing there longer than necessary after he was gone. Because that small change, the direction, shifted something inside my understanding of him. It meant this wasn't just a personal routine. He was going somewhere specific. But again, I didn't ask. And that wasn't only because of curiosity or hesitation. It was also because of the role I had quietly accepted within my family. The role of the person who didn't interfere. Every family has invisible roles like that. There's the storyteller, the planner, the worrier. And then there are people like me, the observers, the ones who notice things but don't always interrupt the flow of life to question them. I had spent years filling that role so naturally that it never occurred to me I could step outside it. So instead of confronting my father the next morning, I simply stored the new information away. He walked toward the older houses. He carried food. He returned with empty containers. Those facts settled quietly into place, like pieces of a photograph slowly coming into focus. But something else happened after that night. Once I knew the direction he walked, my mind began reconstructing the pattern of his evenings more clearly. I realized his trips usually lasted about 40 minutes, sometimes an hour. And once, only once, I remembered him returning much later than usual, nearly 11. That detail had seemed insignificant at the time. Now it didn't. Because when someone follows the same routine for years, any small variation becomes meaningful. And without realizing it, I began waiting for that variation to happen again. Not actively, just quietly aware. Because curiosity has a way of growing slowly. It doesn't always explode into action. Sometimes it sits patiently inside you, until one small moment arrives that makes observation no longer enough. That moment came a few weeks later. On a night when the temperature dropped suddenly, the entire neighborhood was covered in a thin layer of ice. The kind of night when most people would choose to stay inside. But at exactly 9 o'clock, my father still left the house. And that was the night something inside me shifted. The night everything shifted didn't feel important at first. It was simply cold. The kind of cold that makes the air look sharp under streetlights and turns every patch of pavement into a quiet hazard. Earlier that evening, the local weather report had warned about black ice forming after sunset. Most people in our neighborhood listened. Cars stayed in driveways. Porch lights turned off early. The street outside our house grew unusually still. Inside, the house felt warm and quiet. I had wrapped myself in a blanket on the couch while sorting through some old photos I had brought home from the archive to organize later. At around 8:45, my father walked into the kitchen. The same routine began. Refrigerator door opening. Containers are placed on the counter. But that night, I noticed something slightly different. He moved more slowly than usual. Not tired exactly, just careful. He packed the containers with the same methodical attention he always had. Soup in one. Bread wrapped in a napkin. A small apple was placed gently in the side pocket of the canvas bag. Then he glanced out the kitchen window. Not once, twice. The wind rattled the branches outside, and I could hear the faint scrape of ice along the sidewalk when a car passed down the street. For the first time since I had started noticing his routine, a thought crossed my mind that felt heavier than simple curiosity. Maybe tonight he won't go. But at 8:59, he did what he always did. He reached for the brown jacket. I stood up from the couch before I fully realized why. "You know it's icy out there, right?" I said casually. My father looked at me for a moment. Not surprised, just thoughtful. "I'll be careful," he said. His voice was calm, the same steady tone he used for almost everything. Then he opened the door. Cold air slipped into the house as he stepped outside. The door closed softly behind him. I stood there for a few seconds longer than usual, because for the first time, the routine didn't just feel mysterious. It felt important. Important enough that he would still leave the house on a dangerous night. Important enough that the weather didn't change the plan. That realization stayed with me as I returned to the couch, but I couldn't focus on the photos anymore. My mind kept circling the same quiet question. Where does he go that can't wait until morning? Minutes passed. 10, then 20. The house felt even quieter than usual. Eventually, I stood up again and walked to the front window. The streetlights reflected faintly off the icy pavement. No one was outside. The entire block looked frozen in place. I tried to imagine my father walking along those slick sidewalks with a bag full of food. And suddenly, something about the situation felt wrong. Not suspicious, but incomplete. For years, I had accepted the routine without questioning it. For weeks, I had observed it quietly. But that night, something inside me changed. Not dramatically, just a small internal shift. Observation had reached its limit. Curiosity had quietly crossed into responsibility. Because if my father was risking icy streets every night for something, then maybe it mattered enough that I should finally understand why. The thought didn't feel rebellious. It didn't feel like spying. It felt more like following a thread that had been hanging in front of me for years. And once you see a thread like that clearly, it becomes very hard not to pull it. That night, I didn't follow him. Not yet. But the decision had already started forming somewhere deep inside my mind. And a few nights later, when the streets were quiet again and the clock reached 9, I finally did something I had never done before. I grabbed my coat, and I walked out the door a few minutes after he did. The night I decided to follow my father, I didn't tell anyone. Not my mother, not even myself fully. It didn't feel like a plan. It felt more like a quiet decision that had been forming for years and simply reached the surface at the right moment. That evening was calmer than the icy night before. The temperature had risen slightly, and the sidewalks were clear again. Our neighborhood returned to its usual quiet rhythm. Dinner ended around 8. My mother watched television. My father read the newspaper at the table. I sat nearby with my laptop, pretending to organize documents for work. In reality, I was watching the clock in the corner of the screen. 8:47. 8:52. 8:56. Every small movement in the kitchen felt sharper that night. When my father stood up at 8:57 and walked toward the refrigerator, I noticed how familiar the routine had become. Containers. Napkin. The canvas bag was waiting on the counter. It was the same sequence I had seen dozens of times before. The difference was that now I understood something important. He wasn't hiding what he was doing. He simply never expected anyone to ask. That realization made the situation feel strangely gentle rather than secretive. Still, I stayed quiet. Silence had always been my role in the family. But that night, silence became something different. Not passive, intentional. At 9 o'clock exactly, my father reached for his jacket. "I'll be back later," he said, the same words he always used. My mother nodded without looking away from the television. The back door opened, then closed. I waited. 5 minutes. Just enough time for him to reach the end of the street. Then I stood up quietly and grabbed my coat from the hallway. My heart wasn't racing the way people describe in stories about following someone. Instead, I felt unusually calm. Curiosity had replaced uncertainty. When I stepped outside, the night air felt cool but manageable. The streetlights cast long reflections across the pavement, and the neighborhood looked peaceful. Rows of houses with dim porch lights and curtains drawn for the night. I walked slowly toward the corner where I had seen my father disappear weeks earlier. The same direction, toward the older houses. From a distance, I could see him walking ahead. Not hurried, not cautious, just steady. He carried the canvas bag over one shoulder and moved with the relaxed pace of someone who had walked this route many times. I kept far enough behind that he wouldn't notice me. At that hour, there weren't many people outside, but the neighborhood had enough trees and parked cars to provide cover. As I followed him, something unexpected happened. The further we walked, the clearer the destination became. He wasn't wandering. He wasn't walking for exercise. He was heading toward a specific house. A small one near the end of the block where the street curved slightly. I recognized it vaguely, not because I had ever been inside, but because it had always seemed quieter than the others. The porch light was almost never on. The curtains stayed closed most of the time. If someone had asked me before that night who lived there, I probably wouldn't have had an answer. My father slowed his pace as he approached the house. Then he walked up the short pathway toward the front door. I stopped across the street, partly hidden by the shadow of a tree. From there, I watched him do something I had never expected. He didn't knock loudly. He tapped softly on the door. 3 gentle knocks. Then he stepped back and waited. A few seconds passed. The door opened slowly, and in the dim porch light, I saw the person standing on the other side. An elderly woman. Thin. Carefully holding the doorframe as if standing took effort. My father lifted the canvas bag slightly and said something I couldn't hear from across the street. But I could see the woman's smile. Not the polite kind. The kind that appears when someone recognizes a kindness they've been waiting for. In that moment, everything about the bag, the containers, the routine, finally made sense. But what I didn't understand yet was something even more important. Because when my father stepped inside that small house, he stayed there much longer than I expected. And that was when I realized this nightly visit was not just about delivering food. It was about something deeper, something no one in our family had ever talked about. From across the street, the house looked even smaller than I remembered. It sat slightly lower than the others, as if it had settled into the ground over time. The paint on the wooden siding had faded into a soft gray, and the front porch leaned just a little to the left. Not abandoned, but quiet in a way that suggested the world had slowly moved on around it. When my father stepped inside, the door closed gently behind him. And then, the street became silent again. I stood under the tree for a moment, unsure what to do next. Following him had felt natural up until that point. But standing outside someone else's house in the dark suddenly made me aware of how unusual the situation actually was. So I moved a little further down the sidewalk and sat on a low stone edge near the curb. From there, I could still see the small porch. The light above the door stayed on. Inside the house, faint shadows moved occasionally across the curtains. At first, I assumed my father would leave after a few minutes. Maybe he was simply delivering the food and making sure the woman was all right. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Still nothing. The quiet stretched longer than I expected. That's when I began noticing details about the house itself. The mailbox by the front steps leaned slightly forward, its paint chipped by years of weather. The name printed on the small metal label was almost worn away. I squinted under the streetlight to read it. M. Callahan. The name didn't mean anything to me, but something about seeing it written there made the situation feel more real. This wasn't just a mysterious stop in my father's routine. It was someone's home. Someone who lived here alone. A faint yellow glow appeared through the front window after a few minutes, as if a lamp had been switched on inside. Through the thin curtains, I could see the movement of 2 figures. One taller. One much smaller. The shapes shifted slowly, like people sitting at a table. Then I noticed something that caught my attention. My father wasn't standing. He was seated. That meant he hadn't just delivered the food and left. He was staying. Another 10 minutes passed. I watched the window carefully. The shadows moved occasionally. One leaning forward, one lifting a hand. Small gestures that looked like conversation. I couldn't hear anything from across the street, but the rhythm of the movements suggested something familiar. Not urgency. Not an obligation. Something more like company. The realization arrived quietly. My father wasn't just bringing food. He was spending time with her. And suddenly, the routine made even more sense. 40 minutes, sometimes an hour. The length of his nightly trips had never matched a simple delivery, but it did match something else. A visit. I tried to imagine the conversation happening inside. Maybe simple questions. How was your day? Did the doctor call? Is the heater still working? The kinds of small exchanges that seem ordinary when people share a household, but become precious when someone lives alone. Another light inside the house turned on briefly, then off again. More shadows moved. More quiet gestures. Watching from the street, I realized something else, too. No one else in the neighborhood seemed aware of this routine. Cars occasionally passed at the far end of the block, but none slowed near the house. The curtains on nearby homes stayed closed. To everyone else, this street probably looked like any other quiet residential road late at night. And that's when I understood the deeper reason the routine had gone unnoticed for so long. Not because my father was hiding it, but because the act itself was so small that most people would never think to look for it. There was no announcement, no recognition, no social media post about helping a neighbor, just a man walking down the street every night with a bag of food. The kind of kindness that disappears easily into the background of everyday life. Eventually, after nearly 40 minutes, the front door opened again. My father stepped onto the porch. He turned back briefly, saying something I couldn't hear. The elderly woman stood inside the doorway, holding the frame the same careful way I had seen earlier. She nodded slowly. Then she smiled. It was a small smile, but it carried the quiet warmth of someone who had just spent time with a person who truly saw them. My father lifted the empty canvas bag slightly. She waved once. Then he walked back down the path. I quickly stood and turned away, pretending to examine something across the street until he passed by. He didn't notice me. He simply walked home the same steady way he had walked there. And as I followed from a distance, something settled into place inside my mind. For years, my father had left the house at exactly 9 o'clock. Not for exercise, not for solitude, but for something almost invisible to the rest of the world. A nightly visit to a neighbor most people probably forgot existed. Yet even as that realization brought clarity, one question remained. Because kindness like that rarely begins without a story behind it. And I had a feeling my father's connection to Mrs. Callahan hadn't started by accident. When my father walked past me on the way home that night, he looked exactly the same as he always did. Calm, unhurried. The empty canvas bag rested lightly against his side. If someone else had seen him, they probably would have assumed he had just returned from a simple walk around the neighborhood. But now I knew better. I followed him back at the same distance, letting him reach our house first. The back door closed softly behind him before I stepped onto our street. Inside, the house looked exactly as it always did at that hour. The television still murmured quietly in the living room. My mother had fallen asleep on the couch with a blanket over her legs. My father placed the bag on the kitchen counter and rinsed the empty container in the sink. No ceremony. No explanation. Just another finished routine. I stood in the hallway for a moment, watching him through the doorway. The strange thing was, I didn't feel the urge to confront him. Seeing the truth had already answered the question I'd carried for years. But a few days later, another small discovery deepened my understanding. One afternoon, while helping my mother sort old paperwork in a kitchen drawer, I came across a folded envelope with my father's handwriting on it. Inside was a short note addressed to Margaret Callahan. It wasn't dramatic, just a few simple lines. If you ever need anything, please let me know. My daughter and I live 3 houses down. You're not alone here. The date written at the bottom was nearly 7 years old. That meant my father hadn't just started helping recently. He had been doing it quietly, night after night. For years. No one had praised him. No one had even noticed. Except, finally, me. And suddenly I realized something that made the entire story feel even deeper. Because kindness like that doesn't begin randomly. It usually begins with a moment most people would forget. But someone like my father never would. After that night, I had 2 choices. The first was the easiest. Pretend I had never followed him. Pretend the routine was still a mystery. Let my father continue his quiet walks at 9 o'clock without ever acknowledging what I had seen. In many ways, that option fit perfectly with the role I had always played. The observer. The daughter who didn't interrupt things that seemed to be working. And part of me believed my father might even prefer it that way. His kindness had clearly never been meant for attention. For 7 years, maybe longer, he had walked down that street carrying food to Mrs. Callahan without telling anyone, without asking for recognition. He had built the routine carefully, almost invisibly, like something delicate that might break if exposed to too much light. So remaining silent felt respectful. But the second choice lingered quietly in my mind. Not confrontation, not revealing that I had followed him. Something smaller than that. Something gentler. The choice to understand more. Because even though I had seen the visits with my own eyes, there were still parts of the story I didn't know. Why Mrs. Callahan? How had my father first met her? And why had he decided to help in such a steady, quiet way for so many years? Those questions didn't feel like curiosity anymore. They felt like pieces of a story that deserved to be seen clearly. So I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of asking my father directly, I started paying closer attention to the neighborhood itself. It wasn't difficult. As a community archivist, I was already used to researching local records and small histories that people rarely notice. During the next few days, I took a longer route home from work that passed through the older section of our neighborhood, the same street where Mrs. Callahan lived. In daylight, the house looked even more fragile than it had at night. The front steps were worn smooth from decades of use. The small garden by the walkway had long since grown wild, but the mailbox still carried the faded label. M. Callahan. One afternoon, I stopped near the sidewalk and pretended to check something on my phone while looking at the house more closely. A curtain moved slightly in the front window, just a small motion. Someone inside. Still there. That realization carried a quiet weight. Because loneliness can hide in plain sight inside neighborhoods like ours. Rows of houses. Closed doors. Lives that slowly become smaller and quieter over time. Most people pass by without noticing. My father, apparently, had not. Over the next week, I began to notice other things too. Groceries are occasionally left on the porch during the day. A visiting nurse's car parked outside once in the afternoon. Little signs that the woman inside the house needed help, but probably didn't receive much of it regularly. And the more I noticed those details, the more I understood something about my father's nightly visits. He wasn't just bringing dinner. He was making sure someone wasn't forgotten. That realization made my earlier question feel less important. It no longer mattered exactly how their connection had started. What mattered was that my father had quietly chosen a responsibility most people would never even see, and that left me with one final decision: whether to continue standing outside that story as an observer, or to step into it, gently, without disturbing the quiet kindness that had been there all along. I didn't decide immediately, but a few evenings later, when the clock moved toward 9 again, I found myself standing in the kitchen watching my father prepare the familiar canvas bag. And for the first time in my life, I spoke before he reached the door. The evening I finally spoke, nothing about the house looked unusual. My mother was folding laundry in the living room. The television played softly in the background. And in the kitchen, my father was doing what he had done hundreds of times before. Packing the canvas bag, soup in one container, bread wrapped in a napkin. A small orange was placed carefully in the side pocket. He moved with the same quiet rhythm I had watched for weeks. Except now I understood the destination. I leaned against the kitchen counter, watching the familiar routine unfold. For a moment, I almost stayed silent again. Not because I was afraid, but because the routine felt delicate, like something that had survived for years precisely because no one had interfered with it. Still, the words came before I had time to reconsider. "Do you need an extra container tonight?" My father paused, just slightly, not startled, Just thoughtful. He looked at me in the calm way he always had. "What for?" he asked. I walked to the refrigerator and opened it, taking out a small container of pasta left from dinner. "For Mrs. Callahan," I said gently. The kitchen became very still. Not tense, just quiet in a different way. My father studied my face for a moment, as if measuring something. Not suspicion, understanding. Then he nodded once. "You followed me," he said. It wasn't a question. I smiled slightly. Yes. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. I expected him to explain, or ask why. But he didn't. Instead, he opened the canvas bag and shifted the containers slightly to make room. "Thank you," he said quietly. That was it. No lecture, no embarrassment, just a simple acknowledgement that the secret had become shared. And strangely, the moment felt peaceful, almost natural, like something that had been waiting to happen. A few minutes later, when the clock reached 9, he reached for his jacket the same way he always did. But this time, before he stepped out the door, he looked back at me. "You coming?" He asked. The question caught me off guard. Not because I hadn't imagined it, but because he asked it so casually, as if inviting someone on an ordinary evening walk. I grabbed my coat from the hallway. We stepped outside together. The street looked the same as every other night. Quiet houses, soft porch lights, the cool air settling across the pavement. We walked side by side without speaking, and the silence between us felt different now. Not distant, shared. When we reached Mrs. Callahan's house, my father tapped gently on the door the same way I had seen before. 3 soft knocks. A moment later, the door opened. Mrs. Callahan stood there holding the frame, her small figure wrapped in a thick sweater. When she saw my father, her familiar smile appeared. Then she noticed me standing beside him. Her eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise. "Well," she said warmly, "and who have we brought tonight?" My father shifted the bag lightly on his shoulder. "This is my daughter," he said. "Thought you might like some company." Mrs. Callahan's smile widened. "Oh," she said softly, "I always appreciate company." And just like that, without any dramatic announcement or explanation, the quiet routine that had belonged to my father alone for years became something we shared. The first evening I walked into Mrs. Callahan's house with my father, nothing about it felt dramatic. In fact, the most surprising thing was how ordinary it felt. The living room was small, but warm. A lamp near the couch cast a soft yellow light across the walls, and the air carried the faint smell of chamomile tea. There were photographs everywhere. Old frames on shelves. Black and white portraits on the wall. Most of them showed people I didn't recognize. Young couples, children in school uniforms, a man in a military jacket standing beside a smiling woman who looked very much like a younger version of Mrs. Callahan. The house didn't feel empty. It felt like a place where time had simply slowed down. My father placed the canvas bag on the kitchen table the way he always did. Mrs. Callahan lowered herself carefully into a chair, watching him unpack the containers with quiet familiarity. "You've brought reinforcements tonight," she said, nodding toward me. My father smiled faintly. She caught me. Mrs. Callahan laughed softly at that. "Well," she said, looking at me with kind eyes, "I suppose secrets don't stay secrets forever." The 3 of us sat together while my father warmed the soup on the stove. I noticed how easily the routine unfolded. He knew exactly where the bowls were kept, exactly which cabinet held the spoons, exactly how long did the old stovetop take to heat. This wasn't a new kindness. This was years of quiet habit. As we ate, Mrs. Callahan asked me questions about my work at the archive. Not quickly, not out of politeness, but with genuine curiosity. "What kinds of stories do you preserve there?" she asked. "Mostly small ones," I said. "Letters, photographs, local histories people forget about." She nodded slowly. The small ones are usually the most important. My father didn't say much during the conversation, but every now and then I noticed him watching Mrs. Callahan carefully. Not in a worried way, but in the attentive way someone watches a person they care about. At one point, she coughed lightly, and he slid a glass of water across the table without interrupting the conversation. It was such a small gesture that it might have gone unnoticed. Except I was beginning to understand something. This wasn't just charity. It was companionship. A quiet agreement between two people who had built trust over time. And that's when I began noticing something else. Mrs. Callahan spoke about the neighborhood the way people do when they've lived somewhere for decades. She remembered families who had moved away, stores that had closed, children who used to ride bicycles down the street. "Your father helped me shovel the front steps one winter," she told me at one point. That must have been 5 years ago now. My father shrugged slightly. They were icy. "That's when the visits started," she added gently. I glanced at him. He didn't correct her, but he didn't elaborate either. The story was offered quietly, like a puzzle piece placed on the table without explanation. Later that night, after we finished eating and packed the empty containers back into the bag, my father helped her adjust the thermostat near the hallway. Before leaving, he asked the same question he must have asked hundreds of times. "You need anything tomorrow?" Mrs. Callahan shook her head. "No, dear. Tonight was perfect." When we stepped back outside, the night air felt cooler than before. We walked home the same way we had come, and something about the street felt different now. Not because anything had changed physically, but because I understood the routine for what it truly was. A small act repeated over the years. A quiet presence in someone else's life. The consequences of that kindness were invisible to most people. But inside that small house, they meant everything. For the next few weeks, the routine continued. 9 o'clock, the canvas bag, the short walk down the quiet street. Sometimes I joined my father. Sometimes I let him go alone, the way he had for so many years. Nothing about those evenings felt extraordinary while they were happening. They were filled with small conversations, warm bowls of soup, and stories from Mrs. Callahan about the neighborhood as it used to be. But one evening, when we knocked on the door, something felt different immediately. The porch light wasn't on. My father knocked gently. 3 soft taps. We waited. No answer. He knocked again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. For a moment, we stood there quietly, both of us listening to the silence inside the house. Finally, a car pulled into the driveway behind us. A woman stepped out wearing a nurse's jacket. She looked at us with a kind but tired expression. "You're Mr. Nguyen, right?" she asked my father. He nodded slowly. The nurse's voice softened. "She asked me to tell you. Thank you." My father didn't say anything. The nurse continued gently. "She passed away this afternoon." The words settled into the cold evening air. Not shocking. Mrs. Callahan had been fragile for a long time, but hearing it still carried a quiet weight. The nurse handed my father a small envelope. "She wanted you to have this." Then she walked inside the house. My father held the envelope in his hands for a long moment. The canvas bag hung quietly at his side. For the first time in years, there would be no reason to walk here at 9 o'clock anymore. Some routines end quietly like that, not with drama, just with a door that no longer needs to open. We didn't open the envelope right away. My father slipped it into the pocket of his jacket, and we walked home the same way we always had. The street looked unchanged. The same porch lights, the same quiet houses. But the walk felt different. Not heavier exactly, just quieter. When we reached the kitchen, my father placed the canvas bag on the counter the way he had done every night for years. Except this time he didn't unpack it. He stood there for a moment, then finally took the envelope from his pocket. He opened it carefully. Inside was a small, folded letter and a photograph. The photo showed Mrs. Callahan many years younger, standing beside the same house with a man in a Navy uniform. Both of them were smiling at the camera, the way people used to smile in old photographs. Fully, without hesitation. My father looked at the photo for a long moment. Then he read the letter silently. When he finished, he handed it to me. The handwriting was shaky but clear. Thank you for reminding me that I was still part of the world. Those evenings meant more than you know. Please tell your daughter I'm glad she came. It was nice not to eat alone. I folded the letter slowly. The kitchen stayed quiet for a moment. Finally, I asked the question that had been waiting since the first night I followed him. How did it start? My father leaned against the counter. Her husband died, he said calmly. Winter storm about 7 years ago. She slipped on the front steps trying to clear the ice. He paused. I helped her get inside. Jump. That was it. No heroic story. No dramatic moment. Just a small act that slowly became 7 years of quiet visits. My father picked up the empty canvas bag and folded it neatly. I think, he said softly, everyone deserves someone who knocks on their door once in a while. After Mrs. Callahan passed away, the house at the end of the street grew quiet again. The porch light stayed off most nights. The curtains remained still. And at 9 o'clock, for the first time in years, my father stayed home. At first, the change felt strange. Routines shape a household in ways we rarely notice until they disappear. For so long, 9 o'clock had meant the sound of a jacket being lifted from the chair, the soft closing of the back door, the quiet rhythm of footsteps fading down the street. Now the house simply stayed still. But something had changed in me, too. Before that winter, I had always thought of kindness as something visible. Volunteering, helping publicly, being recognized for doing the right thing. What my father showed me was different. Kindness could also be quiet and consistent. It could happen without anyone praising it, without anyone even knowing it existed. I began noticing small opportunities around me in a way I hadn't before. A neighbor who struggled to carry groceries. An elderly man at the bus stop appreciated conversation more than assistance. Little moments that most people pass without thinking twice. I didn't become a different person overnight, but I started understanding something important. You don't have to change the whole world to matter in someone's life. Sometimes all it takes is showing up and knocking on the door. These days, when the clock reaches 9 o'clock, I still notice it. Not because anything happens, but because something used to. Sometimes my father and I are sitting in the living room when the time passes. Occasionally, our eyes meet for a brief second, and there's a quiet understanding between us. Not sadness exactly, more like gratitude for something that existed. Mrs. Callahan's house was eventually sold the following spring. A younger family moved in, repainting the porch and planting flowers where the old garden had grown wild. Life moved forward the way it always does. But every time I walk past that house, I remember what those evenings meant. Not just for her, for me. Because before all of this, I thought I understood my father. I knew he was quiet. I knew he kept to himself. I knew he rarely spoke about his feelings. What I didn't understand was the depth hidden inside that quietness. For years, he had carried a small responsibility that no one asked him to take. No recognition, no applause. Just a decision he repeated every night at 9 o'clock. Bring food. Sit down. Talk for a while. Make sure someone in the world didn't feel invisible. Watching that changed the way I see people. It reminded me that some of the most meaningful things happening around us are almost impossible to notice unless we slow down enough to look. Because kindness isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a soft knock on a door, repeated hundreds of times. And maybe the real lesson my father gave me isn't about being generous, it's about being present. about noticing the people who quietly disappear from the edges of our communities, about remembering that loneliness often hides behind ordinary doors. So now I want to ask you something, not as a storyteller, just as someone who learned this lesson a little later than she should have. Is there someone in your life, or maybe in your neighborhood, who might simply need someone to knock on their door once in a while? I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.